Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with guest Murphy Brown, who has been an active advocate for education and human rights in the Parkdale area for more than 20 years. In 2014, she started to work as the Children's Program Support Worker at Parkdale Project Read, a not-for-profit literacy organisation in South Parkdale. So let's have a listen.
So thank you so much, Ms. Brown, for coming on to the podcast to speak about the Maroons in Nova Scotia. And in particular, these are the Trelawney Maroons from Jamaica being exiled to Nova Scotia. So before we start, can I just have you introduce yourself to the audience and tell them a little bit about yourself? Thank you.
My name is Murphy Brown. That is my official government name. And the Murphy part comes from my great-grandfather. My father was also named after him. So Murphy is their middle name. Kelly is their first name. So they had these Irish names, which says to me that at some point, people from Ireland had enslaved my ancestors. That's why they ended up with Kelly Murphy. And so when I was born, in those days, they didn't have any way of knowing if it was a boy or a girl.
Yes.
But African Guyanese at that time, they looked forward to having a boy as their first child. So there I was. Oh, it's a girl. We'll name her Murphy anyway. And so my name is Murphy Brown, but my chosen name is Abina Agbetu. Abina because it's the Akan day name for girls who were born on a Tuesday, and that's my chosen name, Abina Agbetu. And Agbetu comes from somebody, an African man who was born in England. I was looking around for a last name. And even though it's not a last name that comes from Ghana, it comes from Nigeria. Some of my ancestors were taken from Nigeria. And I saw this man stand up against the monarch of England. He called them out when they were praising the British for abolishing slavery. And he stood up in Westminster Abbey and he spoke out. I said, I got my last name. Yes, Toyin Agbetu. That's where I got my last name from. I didn't ask him because at the time I had not met him. I did meet him later on when he visited Toronto. I can't remember what year it was. But when I saw that, I said, that's my last name. He reminds me of my grandfather. Stand up.
Yes.
Yeah. So I was born in British Guyana. It's Guyana now. It became Guyana on the 26th of May, 1966. But I was born before then. So it's Guyana now. It was British Guyana then, or BG. And some people used to call it Booker's Guyana because the Booker brothers had a stranglehold on Guyana's economy during the colonization. They made a killing from when slavery was abolished. There were two brothers who had left Britain and gone to Guyana and engaged in, the slave trade, the business around the slave trade, and so on. So when slavery was abolished, they got some money and they just ran with it. And people may have heard of the Booker Prize. Yeah. It's for literature. That's where the money comes from. So if any African in the diaspora wins that Booker Prize, I think this author who was born in Barbados did win the Booker Prize one time. We can call that reparation because it's our money. Yes. And sometimes when I take my grandchildren to the library, or I'm at the library with some friends and I look up and I see certain last names, I say, that's my money because some of my ancestors had that last name.
Yes.
Yeah, so I was born into a Pan-African family. And whenever I visited my grandparents' house, which was a lot, there were huge framed photographs of African royalty. His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie had pride of place. You walked into my grandparents' home and that's the first thing you saw. Before you saw family photographs, there he was in all his glory. And I remember as a child being told, that's what Jesus looked like. That man, because they come from the same line. And a lot of people don't believe that, but that's what people in my family believe. That's what Jesus looked like. So when I went to school, the first school I went to was a Methodist, Kitty Methodist school. And, they had this picture of Jesus. That's not Jesus. I mean, Jesus wasn't a white man with long hair. I know what he looks like. That's not him. And I remember another thing. When I first heard about Queen Elizabeth, I thought she was the sister of His Imperial Majesty because she's a queen, he's a king. I know he has a wife, so that's got to be his sister, right? Mm-hmm. That's how my 6-year-old, I think, mind worked.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, but yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And so, do you want me to call you Miss Agbetu moving forward, or Ms. Brown?
Oh, anyone is fine.
Okay. Okay. I want to make sure. And so, I know you wrote this article and I reached out to you and, what were the circumstances that led to the Trelawney Maroons to arrive in the colony of Nova Scotia in the late 18th century?
Well, they had signed a treaty with the British because they had been fighting since 1655. Well, of course, not the same people because this was 1796. But they had been enslaved by the Spanish. And in their ancestors, I suppose, because we're talking 1796.
Yes.
And when Admirals Penn and Venables chased the Spanish out of Jamaica in 1655, the Africans who had any sense ran to the hills. Freedom! I mean, white people fighting each other, let's get out of here.
Yeah.
The Spanish fled to Cuba. The British took over. They brought people who they enslaved. And surprise, what? The Africans didn't remain to be our slaves? How dare they run away? Let's go and get them. So they had been fighting for more than 100 years, 1655 to 17 something. And of course, the Africans fought back. As a child, I heard all these stories about the Maroons. We also had Maroons in Guyana, but the ones in Jamaica seemed, I don't want to, let's say romantic.
Yes. Yeah.
Very interesting because they were in battle with these people who would dress up in their red serge coats and their heavy boots to go into the hills to do what? Fight with people who weren't wearing shoes, who could run around in that area. And then we heard about Nanny, how she was so fierce, she was so smart that she had the British in state of confusion because here was this little African woman. Well, we assumed she was little in stature, and she outsmarted them every time. So they started spreading rumors. Oh, she's not real, she's a witch. That is to convince themselves that they were superior because no normal African woman could outsmart them. They started inventing stories. She would catch bullets in her teeth and spit it back at us. Once we almost had her, she turned into a bird and flew away. Once she had this big cauldron with smoke coming out of it, and all our soldiers passed out from that smoke. She's a witch. She's not real. And, telling the enslaved Africans that they don't run away and go and join those people because heaven knows what they would do to you. This woman is a witch. So, hearing all these stories about Nanny surrounding the British and maybe saying, don't do anything until you see the whites of their eyes and then attack. And they couldn't handle that. So all these made up stories about Nanny. So we knew about, I don't know how my grandparents knew all these stories about Africans in different places. As far as I know, they had never traveled to any of these places, but they knew about these different things. And so I was always fascinated by the Maroons in different countries, in Mexico, in Brazil, and all of that. But the Jamaican Maroons were amazing. And I was fascinated with the story of when they were, you got to say they were kidnapped because they were forced into those boats and taken to Nova Scotia. They would have preferred to be taken to Africa. That's where their ancestors came from. But, the British decided, no, these are fighting men. We can use them to defend Canada.
Yeah.
And so that's where they took them. They tricked them. These people signed this treaty, and then the British said, well, you've broken the treaty. How? How? No, they were just bullies. I'm surprised they didn't enslave them, but they weren't stupid. They knew if they put those Maroons on a plantation or something, that would have been the end. So they took them to a place where they were outnumbered by white people. Nova Scotia, that cold place.
Yes, that colony. And as you said, it was part of the British Empire because it wasn't necessarily Canada at that time.
No.
But, it's just interesting to know that the British Empire, a lot of things happened within that empire and they could, move people around to different colonies.
Oh, yeah.
And so
some ships waiting there were empty. Well, let's just get them on these ships and take them to Nova Scotia.
Yeah. And, what would you say for the Trelawney Maroons, of course, coming from Jamaica, now having to live in the colony of Nova Scotia? What was that like for them?
Well, they were a proud people. The white people in Nova Scotia were accustomed to enslaved Negroes, so to say. And of course, there would have been people who resisted because everywhere Africans were enslaved, they resisted. You think about any place, whether it's in Central America, North America, South America, the Caribbean islands, and it didn't matter which European tribe enslaved them, whether it was the Danes from Denmark, the Dutch from the Netherlands, the French from France, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Irish, Scottish, English, Welsh from the UK. It didn't matter who enslaved Africans. They resisted in various ways. Yes. So I'm sure there were people in Nova Scotia who were enslaved who resisted in various ways. As a matter of fact, there was a woman, I think her name was Jude, who resisted. And in 1800, the people who enslaved her beat her to death in Nova Scotia. So she didn't engage in armed uprising, but maybe she sassed them, resisted when they tried to rape her. Who knows how she resisted? Because the man and his two sons, I can't remember his name, they were tried in 1801. The surprising thing is that there was a trial. And of course, they were found not guilty. I think the wife of the man was also indicted, but she wasn't tried. It was him and his sons. So Africans resisted in various ways, whether they malingered or poisoned cattle or whatever. However, these were different Africans. They walked with their chests up in the air. They were proud people. They had never been enslaved because, they were Maroons. Mm-hmm. So white people would have looked at them walking around in Nova Scotia and thought, these people shouldn't be here. They're going to give our Negroes ideas. The women and children selling in the marketplace, looking white people in the eyes. Oh no, we cannot have that. So I think that would have been some of the fallout of the Maroons being in Nova Scotia and also as fighting men. The government could use them to repel any attack on Canada. And then they helped to build a citadel, from what I've read. So they were there, and I am sure a lot of the enslaved Africans in Nova Scotia admired these people. Of course, they wouldn't be able to do it openly. Yeah.
No, definitely. And so let's just go back in terms of these Trelawney Maroons. When they left Jamaica, going to Nova Scotia, their status was as free people.
Oh, yes, they didn't enslave them in Nova Scotia, even though it was 1796 and slavery wasn't abolished until 1834 in Canada. It took a little longer in the Caribbean and so on. But my understanding is that slavery was abolished in Canada right on August 1st, 1834, and that there was no apprenticeship system.
Because this made it very important that the Trelawney Maroons were free people.
Because the British government, they weren't stupid. They knew that if they tried to enslave these people, there would probably be an uprising in Nova Scotia. And they didn't want to have anything like that happen in Nova Scotia.
Mm-hmm. And so now I know that your article talks about, these Trelawney Maroons were being formally recognized. So what were some of the developments that led to, the federal government here in Canada formally recognizing the presence of the Trelawney Maroons in Nova Scotia at that time, which is now part of Canada?
It would be the advocacy from people, African Canadians, mm-hmm. that this is very important. This is a part of Canadian history. Because when they left 4 years later to sail to Sierra Leone, some remained in Nova Scotia. And some African Canadians claim Maroon ancestry. So that would lead to them recognizing the Maroon presence in Nova Scotia as being important. And we are in the decade that the United Nations recognized from 2015 to 2024. And some of what was supposed to be done during this decade is recognize African people and their contributions to the world. Absolutely. So I am sure that all of that played into it.
And so, important. With this recognition of the Trelawney Maroons in the colony of Nova Scotia, how has this impacted their history being taught and understood?
I can't really speak to that because I know that over the years, there have been efforts to include African history in the curricula of not just Nova Scotia, but other parts of Canada, because as quiet as it's kept, Africans live in every part of this country. I mean, British Columbia, Quebec. As a matter of fact, the first enslaved African was sold in Quebec. That 6-year-old child that they changed his name. We don't know his African name, but they named him Olivier Lejeune. So Africans lived in every part of this country. British Columbia, the first governor general was a man who was born in British Guyana. He was the child of African woman in Guyana and a man from Scotland, Douglas. And she had 2 children with Douglas. And after he made his fortune, he left and took away her 2 children. I think one boy was 9 and one was 11. And I think the one who became Governor General was the older child. Took them to Scotland. However, as with many of these white men, he married a white woman and boarded these 2 boys off to a family of white people so they could grow up. They were never acknowledged by this man. However, when he returned to Guyana a few years later, he got a daughter with the same woman, even though he had his white wife in Britain. And heaven knows how many of them did that. This mother, he didn't take the little girl with him when he returned to England, to the UK. This mother never saw her 2 boys again. And the elder one, became very British and supported Britain and so on, but the younger one didn't, and we don't hear much about him. But there were Africans, whether they had a white father or whatever, children inherited the status of their enslaved mothers. So there were some of them who were completely white, because after generations of this, and when I was 14 or so, I read this book. Surprisingly, it was two men from Nigeria, Yoruba, who were in Guyana as students from a Canadian university, and I will never forget their names. One was Olajide Windapo. I was fascinated with these names because in Guyana, we didn't have names like that. And the other one was Fola Ibisimiju. Wow. So I remember how they dressed when they weren't working at the stock farm. They dressed in their shokoto, that's kind of trousers, and the agbada, this like resplendent top that had these wide sleeves, and then their hats. Can't remember the names of the hats. And they would come to visit us, and because my parents were interested, and they would tell us about Nigeria and that they were Yoruba and so on. And they gave us this book. And it's the first time I learned in detail about slavery and when these enslaved African women got into these sexual relationships where they were forced into. If it was an African woman and a white man, the child was called a mulatto. And then if the mother was mulatto and the father was white, they were called an octoroon? No, quadroon.
That's right.
And if it was a quadroon and a white man, the child was called an octoroon. An octoroon and a white man, the child was called a musty. And a musty and a white man, the child was called a mustifino. When do they turn white? Because by the time they're mustifino, you can't tell the difference between them and a white person.
Yeah.
And that's how that Tignon law in New Orleans came about, because some of these enslaved women, remember, they inherited the mother's status.
Yes.
They looked white. So the law was passed. You must wear a tignon, which is a head wrap, so that we can tell you from a distance and we can disrespect you because you're not a white woman. However, I digress.
That's fine. That's fine. That's not a problem. And then, as you mentioned before, there are, from these Trelawney Maroons, not all of them went to Sierra Leone. Some remained in the colony of Nova Scotia, which is now of Nova Scotia. How has this recognition impact the community for them and, enhanced for their descendants?
I don't know if there would be any enhancement there. Over the time I've been in Canada, I have read so much about how African Canadians suffer in Nova Scotia. I don't know if you've heard of Africville.
Yes, I have.
Yes. So they would be proud to know that their ancestry is being recognized, I would think. But I can't see them benefiting. They can be proud.
Yes.
They would probably go to school and say, I'm descended from the Maroons. However, I have known African Canadians whose people have been in this country for many generations. And I have heard some horror stories about being called the N-word in school by teachers, no less.
Well,
I know a woman, this didn't happen in Nova Scotia, but she was born in Canada, her parents, grandparents, and so on. And she said that her father worked on the railway because, that's the most important job they could get as porters.
yes.
And whenever a teacher called one of them the N-word or did something like that, the mother would walk into the school and physically assault that teacher, and then she would be locked up. And then the father would have to get, what do you call it? When you send to tell somebody something important, we don't have to use that.
Oh, the telegraph.
Telegram. You need to come and bail your wife out of jail because she's assaulted a teacher again. I was fascinated with some of those stories. Another woman told me that she remembers as a child them driving through Ontario and police stopping her father and racially abusing him. And her mother, they're sitting in the back seat, and she could see her mother digging her nails into the father's hand, like just pleading with him, don't give these people an excuse to physically assault you.
Yeah.
She's not saying anything, but she's just digging her nails into his hand. And she said when they would dress up on Sundays to go to church, white people would be throwing things on them as they ran to get on the TTC to go to church in Toronto. So I cannot even imagine what happened to people in Nova Scotia, which to my understanding is way more racist than Toronto.
Wow. It just, that says a lot right there. And so, with the federal government, formally recognizing these, the Trelawney Maroons, would you say that this can at least, be a part of, I guess, broader discussions about historical injustices and in reparations?
Yes, definitely. What happened to me, the more stories that come out, and we have some excellent historians like Dr. Afua Cooper, I'm so embarrassed, Natasha L. Henry Dixon. I've known Natasha for years. I remember meeting her at Burke's bookstore a few decades ago. She didn't have any children then, but her daughter just finished her first year in university. So you can imagine how long ago that was, like more than 20 years ago. And she was doing her research. And since then, she has improved by leaps and bounds. And there are others like, I think, Charmaine Nelson and so many historians. And there's that African saying, until the lion has its own historian, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Well, we've got our own historians, and they are doing an amazing job. Look, years ago, Dr. Afua Cooper wrote that book about the hanging of Angelique, about Marie Joseph Angelique, who was accused of burning down half of Montreal. And if you read that book, where they tortured that woman until she confessed, they broke the bones in her legs.
Yes. Yeah.
So with more and more of this information coming forward and the acknowledgement that there was slavery and ill treatment of Africans, enslaved Africans in Canada, even after slavery was abolished, there was still ill treatment. There was segregation in this country. I mean, many people know about Black Wall Street and what happened in the States, where they destroyed this thriving neighborhood. But many people do not know that the first time in North America that an African community was destroyed by white people, it happened here in Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, the first time I read about all this was when I bought a book in 1981. And whenever I write an article, I always try to write about some of the history of African people in Canada. Sometimes I write about other places. Of course, I write about Guyana, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, a lot about the States. But yes, the history since 1628, when that 6-year-old child was sold here, there has been an African presence in Canada. Dr. Rex Nettleford, who was a Jamaican, he's the first person I heard use that term, African presence. There has been an African presence, and I've used it since then. So many people don't know. I remember once a white person said to me, there were no Black people in Canada before the 1960s. I'm Canadian and I know. Okay.
Yeah, again, it comes down to knowing your history. And, Canada was colonized by both the French and the British, and they both traded in human flesh during their empires. So
yeah,
to think that,
yes,
it's because of that trade, these enslaved Africans were throughout their empire. So what else, for the federal government recognizing recognizing the Trelawney Maroons, what other, I guess, initiations that they're doing or public education efforts that they're doing to remember the Trelawney Maroons?
I don't see anything being done except in our community here and there. I mean, even in this decade, this important decade,
Yes,
that so many African people, and when I say African people, I'm talking about from the continent and the diaspora, because I identify as an African woman who was born in South America. Unless we put forward the effort, nothing is being done. Even some white organizations will get money to recognize African history. And what do they do? Most of them will have, come and share some dance and food. That's it. There is a reluctance to acknowledge the African presence in Canada. There really is. Many people, when they're celebrating Simcoe Day, do not know anything about Chloe Cooley, who is the person who struggles when she was being sold to somebody in New York by the person who enslaved her in Ontario, struggled mightily. She fought, she screamed. It took about 4 white men to beat her into submission, put her in a boat, tie her up, and row her across the Niagara to New York to sell her. That is why Simcoe made an attempt to abolish slavery in Ontario. And of course, he wasn't successful. I don't know if he was really serious or if, it was just a show. But there was this man, there's a high school in Toronto named after him. What is the name? Anyway, many of these people were slaveholders who were part of the government in Ontario. So there was no way they would have let him pass a law. There is this man, Peter Russell, was one of the people who would have been against abolishing slavery, because one of the most famous ads that I know almost word for word is Peter Russell selling a 40-year-old woman named Peggy and her 15-year-old son Jupiter in Ontario. And he was selling her for $150 and her son for $200. And if you had cash, you get them for 25% off. Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
Right here in Toronto. I remember the first time I saw that ad, I was in shock. And in that ad, of course, it wouldn't have mentioned that Peter Russell and his sister also enslaved Peggy's two little girls. So he's selling Peggy and Jupiter, and the two little girls, he's keeping them. Then later on, his sister gave away one of the little girls to her goddaughter as a wedding present.
Yeah.
Can you imagine? And there are so many other ads. Oh, I found it. To be sold, a Black woman named Peggy, aged about 40 years, and a Black boy, her son named Jupiter, aged about 15 years. Both of them the property of the subscriber. That's Peter Russell. The woman is a tolerable cook and washerwoman and perfectly understands making soap and candles. So that means he doesn't have to buy soap and candles. See how much he is saving? The boy is tall and strong of his age and has been employed in country business. That means he could look after cows and so on, but brought up principally as a house servant. They are each of them servants for life. You see the British? He's not calling them slaves. The price for the woman is $150. For the boy, $200. Payable in 3 years with interest from the day of sale and to be properly secured by bond. But 1/4 less will be taken in ready money. Peter Russell, February 10th, 1806. And there are people, I remember once when I wrote about slavery in Canada, somebody wrote to me and said slavery was abolished in Canada in 1796. No, it wasn't. Simcoe tried to abolish slavery, but here is Peter Russell selling Peggy and Jupiter in 1806. That proved slavery was alive and well way past 1796.
Definitely.
And shockingly, Peggy was married to a free African Canadian man, but she was owned by Peter Russell and his sister. And because of that, her children were owned by Peter Russell.
Mm-hmm.
Her husband was Mr. Pompadour. And the first time I read about Mr. Pompadour was in something that Dr. Afua Cooper had written. I said, oh, Peggy had a husband. Because they never used to allow people to get married, you know.
Mm-hmm. Especially during that time.
They wanted to have children.
And so, as we close out this podcast, at this particular episode, what would you say to the listeners as to what we can kind of, I guess, learn from the Trelawney Maroons coming to the colony of Nova Scotia?
What we can learn is that we are not islands. Where I was born in Jamaica, I was born in Barbados, I was born in Guyana. I'm not an African. Yeah, you may have been born in these specific places, but you don't know where your ancestors were sold from before they arrived in the place where you were born. The Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who is considered the father of Pan-Africanism, spoke about knowing our history. To me, it's a shame that people don't know more about this man, and that we are isolated in these little pockets where, reparations for people whose ancestors were slaves in the U.S. Well, what about people who were born in the U.S., but their parents were from somewhere else? Do you know? Just because they can't directly trace their ancestry to slavery in the U.S., why shouldn't they get reparations too? And just to say, I know there will be reparations. It mightn't be in my lifetime, but think about it. In the 1700s, how many enslaved Africans do you think thought that 100 years down the road, their descendants would be free people?
Yeah.
When this man, Thomas Thistlewood, wrote in his diary about all the girls and women he raped on his plantation, he couldn't have imagined that, 200 years later, their descendants would be reading this shameful history of what he did. Mm-hmm. So those of us now in 2024 who are saying, and I've heard people say, there's not going to be any reparations. Yes, there will be. Because in the 1600s, in the 1700s, even in the 1800s, enslaved Africans couldn't believe that someday their descendants would be presidents, prime ministers of the places. None of us in this day, we can read about it, can imagine what happened to our enslaved ancestors. We might think we know, but the horror of it? I mean, I have read some things about what happened to enslaved Africans in British Guyana, or even before that, when the Dutch were in Guyana. I have heard my elders speak about how the Dutch in Guyana used to bury their guilders, gold, whatever. They would dig a hole by a cotton something tree and put Africans in there alive and cover them up, because they knew that the other Africans were so superstitious. They know somebody was put in there alive and they're dead in there now. They would never dig that up to steal that gold. Mm. So horrible. Can you imagine burying somebody alive?
No, absolutely not.
Oh my goodness. So I know that we will get reparations, and I think it's very important that we know our history and that we understand Pan-Africanism. People would say, but those Africans don't like us. Do you know every African? Those two Yoruba students who came from Nigeria and they were at a university in Canada. And then they went to Guyana on a, what do you call it? Where they go somewhere to do research. So they were in Guyana doing their research. And they used to come visit our house, chat with my parents, tell us all kinds of stories, bring records, because then there were these vinyl things.
Mm-hmm.
We had a radiogram. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a long time ago. Play music, show us how Africans dance to this music. And what do you mean Africans don't like us? And one of them had these marks on his face.
Yeah.
And he explained to us why they did it, what it's called, and everything. I have had Africans in Toronto who have befriended me. They thought I was from their country in a lot of cases. I was on the subway. A woman came up to me, started speaking French. The only French sentence I know is, "Je ne parle pas français." Well, when I said that, the woman thought herself, she's lying. She knows. So then she started speaking to me in Lingala because she was from the Congo and she was sure I was Congolese.
Yeah.
And when I like to wear African clothes, and people have, my sister, and start speaking to me in their language, and I don't know what you're saying. I would say, oh, what language are you speaking? Aha. Well, I was born in South America. Oh, South Africa. No, South America. They're puzzled.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's, don't tell me Africans don't like us. I remember once an African woman, she was invited to a Black History Month event. She said, I'm not going. You guys ran away from us and came to North America. She didn't know anything about slavery.
Yeah.
So it's important that we know about each other.
Mm.
I mean, it's all well and good to dance to Bob Marley singing redemption song or Sparrow singing, I'm a slave from a land so far. But let's know our history. Let's make an effort. To me, it's important. Because I was born in a Pan-African family, I was fortunate. But there are other people who were born into that Pan-African family, and not all of us imbibed that knowledge. Some of us will say, oh, you always talking about Africa. That's where we came from. And we need to know. I would love to know specifically, but I guess at this point, I can't because of the name that was given to my ancestors and that I inherited. Brown. What kind of name is that for an African woman? And then in my family, we've got MacLeod from Scotland. And we've got Jones from Wales. Well, the Welsh people. We've got Bennett. We've got Liverpool, Cork. All these names from Europe. So we cannot go to the African continent and say, my ancestors came from here, because that's one of the first things the Europeans did. Strip the Africans of their names, their languages. They weren't even allowed to name their children. Yeah. But my twin grandchildren are Taiwo, and Kende. Taiwo is the firstborn, Kende is the secondborn. It doesn't matter if they're boys or girls or whatever. I pleaded, please name these children Taiwo and yeah.
No, but I think you said it, is that we need to really know our history, no matter how painful, no matter how the story may go, but to really know that history.
We need to know and not fool ourselves, because you can't stop other people from acknowledging their history.
Exactly.
Every year. And they teach their children and their grandchildren. They know their history. But some of us are ashamed. Seriously, our ancestors did not do anything wrong. There is nothing to be ashamed of. We are the ones who suffered, the ones who made us suffer should be ashamed, not us. Come on. And don't shy away from knowing about what happened during slavery. Some people go to African countries to see where their ancestors were possibly held before they were put on those boats and rowed away. Well, they didn't row. It wasn't like row your boat. It was 3 and 4 months of horror. And some of them ended up overboard, either deliberately or they were killed and thrown overboard. But we must know our history. It's important. And find out, if you can, where some of your ancestors were taken from, to bring them to the place where you were born. Like the Americans in Trinidad and Tobago, their ancestors were enslaved in the Chesapeake Bay area mostly. And then, because they fought on the side of the British during the War of 1812, they were given land in Trinidad in 1815 or so. So shouldn't they get reparations when African Americans get reparations? Yes, they should, as far as I'm concerned. But there's some of us who are fighting against that. No, only those who were. Look at Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier and all these people born in the U.S. Where did their parents come from? The Bahamas, Jamaica. Shirley Chisholm, who these people are. Oh, Shirley Chisholm, she was the first African American to run for president of the U.S. And whenever I see that, I remind them or I inform them. Do you know, even though Shirley Chisholm was born in Brooklyn, her mother was an immigrant from Barbados, and her father was an immigrant from British Guyana.
Wow.
Yes. And now they're after, but we need to think Pan-African. When you listen to Bob Marley, listen to the words he's singing. Don't just wind up to the music. Think about what the man is saying, and you will learn something. So let me finish there, because I will go on and on.
No, thank you, Ms. Abina. I really do appreciate your time for coming on and to speak about this, because as I said, in a lot of this, this road of discovery, there's a lot of narratives, there's a lot of stories. They're just of us. And I do believe that in order to research your family tree, you need to really know the history about everything. So
you need to know as much as you can. You can't know everything.
No.
But know as much as you can.
Absolutely.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed this talk.
Thank you so much.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.